Thank you, Don. Great to be here this morning. Got up before dawn. Thought I might need a passport in order to get here. I live down towards Disney. So I didn't know how long it was going to take and how bad the freeways would be. But fortunately, we didn't have much of a problem, so we were able to get here. But you know, these early morning deals are always a little bit hard. They're hard on you and they're hard on me. So hopefully I won't put you back to sleep, and we'll look forward to the time we can spend together. I do want to give one announcement regarding something that's going to be happening at the gathering. I normally wouldn't do this, to come on your turf and to give you an announcement, but I think this is significant enough that you might be interested. During the month of July, we have a guest lecture series on Tuesdays at noon down at First Presbyterian Church, and we bring in special people to do our studies for us. And a week from this Tuesday, which would be the 29th, we have a very, very special guest coming. His name is Major General Dennis Jackson, and he is a two-star general who was in charge of all logistics for both the Afghanistan and the Iraq War. And he's going to be coming and talking about how do you prepare for the big event. And he's a great guy. We grew up together in Cheyenne, Wyoming. Yeah, he was about 3 doors down from us, and he was always a couple of years younger than me, and we always referred to him as Little Denny Jackson. Well, Little Denny Jackson now is a major general in the Army. And in fact, he was just offered the position of 3-star general to be director of logistics for the entire Army, and decided he wanted to spend more time with his family, so he is not going to take that position. So anyway, just to welcome you if you'd like to come and to hear him a week from Tuesday. I think all of us that are on the internet and receive email receive a lot of junk. And we receive a lot of stories, most of which are not worth looking at or reading. They just keep being passed on from one person to the other. But I received one that I thought was fairly humorous, and actually the topic of this is called bathroom humor. And don't be nervous, it's not going to be offensive, but it goes like this. It says, I was barely sitting down when I heard a voice from the other stall saying, "Hi, how are you?" I'm not the type to start a conversation in the men's restrooms at a rest stop, but I don't know what got into me, so I answered somewhat embarrassingly, "Doing just fine." And the other guy says, "So what are you up to?" And what kind of question is that? At that point, I'm thinking, this is just too bizarre, so I said, I'm just like you, traveling east. At this point, I'm just trying to get out as fast as I can when I hear another question. Can I come over to your place after a while? Okay, this question is just too wacky, but I figured I could just be polite and end the conversation. I tell him, well, I have company over, so today's a bad day for me. Then I hear the guy saying nervously, listen, I'll have to call you back. There's an idiot in the other stall who keeps answering all my questions. So, how many of you have gone into a men's restroom and stood at a urinal, and there's a guy next to you on a cell phone using the restroom? Have you ever? Has that happened to you? You know, that is just bizarre. You know, can they hear water? You know, they think you're near Niagara Falls, or what is it when they hear that? But it's just amazing the stuff that goes on. I'm going to deal with a topic today that is probably overly familiar in one respect, and can be a yawner in another respect if you don't understand where I'm coming from and the stories that I'm going to tell regarding this. I'm going to talk about the topic of prayer, but from a little bit of a different angle, and the title of my talk would be Desperate Prayer. There are times in which you pray, and then there are times in which you are desperate when you pray, and there is a difference. Let's have a word of prayer as we get started. Father, we are grateful for the hour that you've given to us early this morning to pause and to reflect upon you and upon your word. All of us, Lord, face times in which we don't know how we'll survive. We don't know how we can live another day. We don't know how we can solve the problems that face us. And so, Lord, help us to understand from your word that there are many, many other people who face that. And help us to learn what they learned, and hopefully we can transfer their strength and their knowledge and insight into our lives. In Christ's name, amen. I happen to serve on the board of directors for a mission organization And the title or the name of this organization is Venture International. It used to be called Venture Middle East. And one of the projects that we have is called Family to Family, where you can support another family for about $40 a month in the Middle East to provide for their needs, their food, their shelter, their clothing, or whatever. And the families primarily are in Egypt, Jerusalem, Jordan, parts of what we would call Palestine. And these people are really quite desperate many of the times. And so a couple weeks ago, I was talking to two of the young men that are on the staff of Venture International. They'd made a trip over there to investigate to see how this money was being distributed. And they came back with a story of how they were in the city of Amman, and I've spent time in Amman. In fact, in the late 60s, I was with Youth for Christ, and part of our assignment was over there, and I was studying Arabic in Amman, Jordan. And so I know a little bit about that part of the world. And so they came back and they told the story how they'd gone to this one family in this one area of Amman just to see how they were doing with the money that they were receiving and so forth. And they were told, listen, there's a family next door you really need to go visit. And so they did. And as they went next door, they saw how desperate their situation was. The father was out on the streets at that point looking for bread crumbs, whatever he could find to bring into the home because they didn't have any food. There was one girl that was 6 years old sitting on the floor peeling paper off the wall and eating it because that's all she had for food was paper. There was another infant that was crying constantly because of hunger. And then they talked to this little boy who was about 4.5 years old and understood that, of course, that he was facing the same dilemma. But they wanted to tell what had happened the night before. Now, this is a Christian family. And the night before, this little boy, before he went to bed and before he went to sleep, he prayed this prayer. He says, Dear Father, he says, you know we're hungry. He says, I'm going to go to bed now. He says, would you bring me chicken in the morning? And you just think about it. It just breaks your heart when you think of the needs of a little boy like that. But it was a desperate prayer. Now, little did he know that two workers from Venture International would show up the next day. And he would not only get chicken, but he would get everything else for at least for a couple of weeks that he was going to need in terms of supplies. And so we all come to points and times in which, we're praying, I'm going to go to sleep now, would you bring chicken in the morning? Because we won't survive if we don't get chicken in the morning. And I'm reminded a couple of weeks ago, Terry Bowden came and spoke at one of our events, and he tells a story of how here he is, one of the fastest rising stars in football, and has even been declared to be the National Coach of the Year and one of the winningest coaches. He's chasing Bear Bryant's record and all the rest of these things. And you know the story, in the middle of the season at Auburn, he's let go. And so he goes from $1 million a year contract to zero. Now, you would think he'd probably saved up enough that he would be okay, but he goes on, he tells a story. He says, I go home, he says, I get with my wife, we begin to cry together, and we fall on our knees and just begin to pray that God would somehow intervene and provide for us. And so there's just various things that go on in people's life, and there's various ways in which people respond to desperate situations. Not all are good. I can remember being on the board of a Christian university in Arkansas. And we were going through a transition of leadership. And the man that the committee that was searching for the new president found happened to be a man from New York. Now, to transfer a man from the state of New York into the state of Arkansas is quite a cultural shock. And so anyway, for whatever reason, they thought he was the man. He moved his family down, and he's involved in trying to run the university. But it becomes very obvious that there's been a mistake. And part of the reason for this understanding is that we begin to realize that there's manipulation going on. He's trying to pit the faculty against the administration, and there's some lying going on. And it's not a healthy, it's a very dysfunctional situation. And so I happen to be in this meeting, and when we bring him in to interrogate and to find out what's going on, and the man loved Pepsis. Pepsis in the morning, Pepsis at night, it didn't matter. He was always drinking Pepsis. But he would sit there with his Pepsi and drinking it, and his leg just bouncing up and down. You know, he was just so hyper from all the caffeine that he had. And after we confronted him on these situations, he says, well, listen, I need to leave. I'll be back when we reconvene after lunch. That was the last we ever saw of him. He went home and got his belongings. And when I say belongings, he just packed his suitcase. He and his wife got in the car, and we've never seen him again. Didn't pack his, didn't move his furniture or any of that stuff. Just took off and was gone. And so when sometimes people face desperate situations, they flee. All right, they just run. And other times they fly off the handle. They get very angry. We know from the stories of men returning from the Afghanistan conflict, or even from the first Iraqi war, that there were men who came home and under the pressure of trying to re-engage themselves into the American culture and deal with their wives, they didn't respond very well, and sometimes they took the lives of their wives. And so that was a way that they responded to a desperate situation. One other quick story, and then we're going to move to the Scriptures. About 10 years ago, I was teaching a Sunday school class at First Presbyterian Church. And after my class, one of the co-leaders of the class came up to me and said, look, my wife is out of town this next week. I've been invited to go skeet shooting. And he says, I know that you like to hunt. And you have a shotgun, don't you? I said, yes. He said, do you mind if I borrow your shotgun so that I can go skeet shooting? I said, sure. Well, come on over to the office. I'll show you how to use it, chamber the shells, all the rest, and I'll be glad to let you use it. Do you need some shotgun shells? Yes, I do. Fine. I'll provide all that for you. And so I did. And about 5 or 6 days later, on a Saturday morning, I received a telephone call from the Seminole County Sheriff's Department. And they said, we want you to know that we've got the body of this man who killed himself. And I said, that was my shotgun. And he said, yes, I know. He said he left a typed note taped to the windshield of his car and said, you're the first one that I ought to call. That was your gun, but you didn't know anything about it. Well, come to find out, this man was in a desperate financial situation. He didn't want his wife to know, didn't want his kids to know, and so his answer was as he took his life. And so there are all kinds of desperate situations that we find ourselves in. Now, I found myself in one in 1986. And what had happened was that I had kind of risen through the ranks of the Youth for Christ organization, had gone from a missionary in the Middle East to a city director in Houston, Texas, to a regional field director, and then I was a national field director, and for 2 years I commuted every week, flew to Wheaton, Illinois. Worked under Jay Kessler, who was the president, and then he decided to move on and to become the president of Taylor University, and I was trying to figure out what on earth I was going to do with my life. And it was like a fog, because, you know, your whole life has been with one group, one organization, one direction, and all of a sudden it's like you're going to go through a divorce. With a family, with people that you love. And it was desperate because I didn't know where I was going to go. I didn't know what was on the other side. And so as I was spending a lot of time in the Word and in prayer, the Lord seemed to open up to me 1 Samuel. And if you have your Bibles this morning, I'd like to just read a portion of this. It comes out of chapter 1. And it has to do with the story of a woman. Now, it's interesting, you know, we're men's men, we like men's stories and how God deals with men. But God chose the life of a woman to help me to understand how to process some of the stuff that I was going through. So if we begin at the first verse, it says, there was a certain man from Ramathaim, a Zophite, from the hill country of Ephraim, whose name was Elkanah, son of Jeroham, the son of Elihu, the son of Tohu, the son of Zuph, an Ephraimite. He had 2 wives. One was called Hannah, the other Peninnah, or Peninnah, however you want to pronounce it. Peninnah had children, but Hannah had none. Year after year, the man went up from his town to worship, and he sacrificed to the Lord Almighty at Shiloh, where Hophni and Phinehas, the two sons of Eli, were priests of the Lord. Whenever the day came for Elkanah to sacrifice, he would give portions of the meat to his wife Peninnah and to all her sons and daughters, but to Hannah he gave a double portion because he loved her. And the Lord had closed her womb. And because the Lord had closed her womb, her rival kept provoking her in order to irritate her. Now, here's what caught my attention. What I was going through at this point was a real feeling of a lack of engagement, lack of productivity, no fruitfulness, barrenness in my soul, barrenness in my spiritual life, trying to figure out how I was going to re-engage that process and try to survive at the same time. As I was looking at this, I began to realize that Hannah has a problem. She's unproductive, she's barren, and it's aggravated. It's aggravated by three things. First of all, it's aggravated by a competitor who rubs it in. Who's her competitor? Well, Peninnah, the other wife of Elkanah, who is very, very fruitful, said that she would taunt her in her barrenness. So it was sad enough and bad enough that she was unproductive, but she's got somebody who's rubbing it in. And you know, a lot of times when we're going through difficult times, there are people that maybe we see as somewhat competitors. A lot of times men are in competition with one another, and you're going through a struggle like this, and they come up and they say, how's it going? And it's the worst question that kind of a person could ask of you, because you know it's going well with them. And they may know it's not going well with you, and they just kind of want to gloat. They wouldn't say that because they're very spiritual. But, you know, they're just kind of enjoying the fact that you're not doing so well and they're doing well, and it's kind of the old dumbwaiter approach, and as you go down, they're going up. And so you just don't want to hear that. And so that's, you know, that's one of the reasons why a lot of times when a man's going through something like this, you can't find him. He hides. He's in pain. And so, you know, it's aggravated by competitors who don't understand how you feel, and as a result of this, they're rubbing it in. It's also aggravated, second of all, by a loving spouse who doesn't get it. Now, I have a wonderful relationship with my wife, Susan. But as I was going through this whole problem, I began to realize a couple of things. One, she doesn't quite get, because she's not a man, she doesn't quite understand what it is that I'm facing. And, you know, a lot of times they want a quick fix to the problem just like you do. And I began to realize that part of the problem was if I came home and tried to process what I was thinking and what I was feeling, what I was doing is I was adding stress to her life. Because she would say to me, don't bring the what-ifs home. Don't bring the hypothetical situations home, because what you're doing is you're creating a great angst within me, because I don't know how to help you. I don't know how to fix this problem that you're going through. And so both of us are miserable in this situation. And this story is very interesting because Elkanah, who I think is probably a godly man and a wonderful husband and provides for his family and all the rest, he says, aren't I better to you than 10 sons? And you know, the answer to that is, no, Elkanah, you're not. You know, sorry. You know, you're a wonderful man. You have a role that you fit and you fulfill within the family, but there's some issues here that you cannot solve in my life. And so that's the second problem. The third problem was the cultural expectations. The cultural expectations at that point in time of a woman in the Middle East in the Old Testament period was that your whole identity was tied and ratcheted to the fact that you would be able to bear children. And oh, by the way, not just children, men, boys. It's very interesting. When we lived in the Middle East, your first child better be a boy. Because if not, you know, they think something's wrong with you spiritually, and they really take pity on you if your first child is a girl. In fact, I can remember the guy that I was working with, Lynn Rogers, while we were there. It was his third child that was born, and it happened to be a daughter, and they'd be walking along the street, and we'd watch this whole process. They would be very happy, and they'd tell their friends, we just had a daughter born. And 9 times out of the 10, they would say, oh, we're sorry. We have a brother who has the same problem. And so, you talk about a male chauvinist society, that's what that is. And so it's not, the cultural expectations is not only that you be fruitful and have children, that you'd have boys. And of course, that's not happening. And in fact, the whole Old Testament concept of blessing had to do with land, children, crops, and flocks. That's how you evaluated how you were doing spiritually. And so, of course, this is not working. And now, in terms of a man's identity, and the cultural expectation is he's a good provider, right? Why did this friend of mine take his life? Because he had lost his sense of identity as a provider for his family. Now, I just cry out wondering, why couldn't we have talked? Why wasn't there a group of men he could have come and we could have sat down with and tried to process this and tried to help? But there was so much pride, so much ego involved that he wasn't able to do that. I can also remember one time early on in our marriage when we were struggling with a kind of a division of labor thing. My wife was handling the checkbook like many wives do. And then we were having children, so she's taking care of the children, and she's fixing the meals and cleaning the house, and I'm going to work and all the rest of these things. And she's saying, it's just too much. I can't handle all of this. And so one day I said, well, why don't you let me take the checkbook and let me do all the finances from this point on? And I remember her handing me the checkbook, and she says, you take the checkbook and you take care of me. Meaning, I'm going to trust you now, that you'll handle all of this. I'm not going to ask a lot of questions, but it's now the responsibilities upon your shoulders. Well, that's the cultural expectations of a man, that he'll be able to take care of his family in that way. And so these were some of the issues that she was facing. Now, let's take a look at her response, because within her response becomes the answer to this dilemma. And it's not really an answer that you'll hear a lot of times from the pulpit or from some of your brothers in Christ. Well, first of all, whenever she went before the Lord of the tabernacle, she was emotionally distraught. It's kind of like saying every time you go to church because you're dealing with a problem, you sit in your pew and you begin to cry. And all of a sudden you begin to realize there's nobody sitting next to you, around you. Nobody wants to be around you. What's going on with this person? Every time they come to church, this is what's going on in their life, or his life. And that's precisely what was happening. And this happened year after year. And as you process this and begin to see what was happening, there was a deterioration of her emotional stability. Words were being used like bitterness, misery, anguish, and grief. And so it just kept on decelerating in her life. Now, there are people, I think, that are dealing with problems that part of the problem is they haven't hit bottom yet. They're struggling. They still think there's light at the end of the tunnel. They still think that there's hope. In fact, I was dealing with a man a couple of weeks ago, and he was talking to me about his work, and that he was working for an ad agency, and they had laid off a lot of people, and as a result of this, they piled on more work on him, and he wasn't able to perform the way that they wanted to perform, and expectations were exceeding his productivity. He was just under enormous stress. And he said to me, he says, Larry, he says, I'm helpless, but I'm not hopeless. And I thought about it for a moment, and I said, maybe you need to be hopeless. Maybe that's the next step. And you'll see it in Hannah. She got to the point where she was not only helpless, but she was hopeless. And so she's embracing her situation. She's embracing her grief. She's not running from it. She's acknowledging it. And she goes before the Lord, and she goes before the tabernacle over and over again, year after year, and expresses these feelings. Now, she also has an ability to express how she feels to a confidant. And this confidant happens to be Eli the priest. Now, Eli is a man who's a man of God who wants to try to understand, to identify with her pain, though he does misinterpret at one point and thinks that she's drunk. Accuses her of being drunk because she is praying silently, her lips are moving, nothing's coming out of her mouth. And still, she believes in the man enough to be able to share what's going on. So at least there's one person that comes into her life in which she can share these things. Now, as she goes through this grief process, let's deal with where the blessings come from. First of all, the blessings come from an understanding of the reality of what Larry Crabb calls the critical longing. You know, Larry Crabb, if you've read any of his material, how many of you have read any of Larry Crabb's materials? Some of you have. He basically says there's three kinds of longings. And when you understand these, you begin to understand who you are and how God responds. You first of all have casual longings. A casual longing is that we have a longing for things. I'd like to have a nicer car. I'd like to live in a different location. I'd like to be able to wear certain kinds of clothes. I mean, just casual things that you have a longing for. So that's one aspect. He says that's one category. Now, usually when you don't get those things, you're irritated, but it doesn't upset you that much. Then you have what are called critical longings. And critical longings are for a job that gives you significance. It's for relationships. It's for the things that create your sense of worth and identity. And if you don't get these, it will create angst in your life and sometimes bitterness of soul. And to some degree, that's exactly what Hannah's going through. She's got a critical longing that's unmet. She wants to have a child. Okay? And she's not running from it. She's embracing it. And then the last one is what's called a crucial longing, which starts with your whole relationship with God and the fact that you cannot even function or survive spiritually if you haven't taken care of the crucial questions of life. And so she understands, she's not going to verbalize it in that way, but she understands this whole process of what she's going through. And so as she deals with this critical longing, the first thing that she does that creates the blessing is she begins to offer that which she holds to be the most dear in her life. And that is the potential fruit of her womb. And to say, Lord, I will give you back whatever it is that you give to me. It's just so important that I go through this process and grip my fear and grip my longings, but that you'll take care of this. And then second of all, there's a man who comes alongside who knows what's at stake. Sometimes we just need somebody who can walk alongside of us, who knows us well enough, knows our family well enough, and sometimes all they do is just say a word of encouragement, and so that as a result of this, you begin to get some peace before you get provision. When my daughter was in high school, she was a senior in high school, was going through a number of difficulties in terms of where she was going to go to college, relationships that she had in school, some of the frustrations that she had in dealing with her mother. I don't know if you've ever had a situation where you've got a mother that's very strong-willed and a teenage daughter that's very strong-willed. I mean, it's a war zone sometimes when this kind of thing goes on. If you've never been around that, you don't know what I'm talking about. But there are a lot of times, where at the dinner table at night, I didn't know which one was going to leave crying first from the dinner table. That's just kind of what we were processing. And as a result of this, it was very frustrating. I couldn't fix it. I was trying to get counseling, to talk to people. We were praying about it. We just didn't know how Erica was going to turn out. And I remember one day we had Ken Davis in town. Ken is a humorist. Maybe some of you have heard of him. He's a great communicator. And he was staying at our house, and I was sharing this stuff with Ken. And Ken said, Larry, he says, let me tell you something. I think in 3 or 4 years, you're going to look back and you're going to see that she really turned out well. I think it's going to be okay. I think you just need to relax about this. Well, there was a certain peace that came over me at that point that I had before the provision took place. Now, it took 2 or 3 years, but after 2 or 3 years, some marvelous things happened in that young girl's life. She went to college, went to seminary. She married a young man in seminary. They both got graduate degrees, both in psychology and also in theology. And they're both now house parents for 5 girls at the Eagle Ranch in Gainesville, Georgia. Sharing their lives, building into the lives of these girls. And so it's really a remarkable thing the way this turned out. Now, the conclusion of the matter is, before we go to our discussion, is that as I read this chapter, and I'm processing my own frustration as to where I am and where I want to go, the Lord seemed to say to me in that process these words. There is a Samuel waiting to be born in your experience. And I cannot tell you how powerful the quiet voice of the Spirit was at that point. Just like somehow there's a Samuel ready to be born. He doesn't exist yet, but he's coming. Well, if you fast forward the tape, and that happened in about 85, 86. Actually, there was twins to be born. One of the children was the gathering of men. We moved here in 87, and John Tolson had asked us to come and to help get this thing started. And so that ministry was birthed out of that experience. And then a couple of years later, we helped start another organization called the Greater Orlando Leadership Foundation. Don referred to that. That child was born. And so there were really twins to be born out of that painful experience that we were going through. And so I would say to you that if you face these things, you need to embrace them. You need to just go ahead and say, it's not much fun. I've got a bitterness of an anguish of soul that I need to express. And you express it to the Lord, and you don't run from that. But out of the desperateness of your prayer, you begin to realize that God is going to answer. Let me just give you a quote that comes from C.S. Lewis. He says this: "Indeed, if we consider the unblushing promises of reward and the staggering nature of the rewards promised in the Gospels, it would seem that our Lord finds our desires not too strong, but too weak." Because you know what the temptation is? You know what the tendency is? Whenever we face this blockage, this lack of productivity, this lack of fruitfulness, whatever it is that we're facing, in order to ease the pain, we turn our back on the desire. See? We back off. We quit praying. We quit thinking about it. We try to just somehow shove it into a closet and lock the door instead of really wrestling with and dealing with the issues that are before us. I've often said, Lord, either take the desire away or change me or provide it. You can do whatever you want. You can give me the provision. But Lord, you're going to have to rip this dream out of my heart because I can't get rid of it. And day and night I have anguish over the lack of whatever it is that I have in my soul. And would you deal with that? And so many of us, though, just don't want to face that. We want to run from it. We want to quit. We want to hide. And so there's no victory that comes in that. There is no solution. There's no Samuel that's waiting to be born in that kind of a situation. So my understanding is that now you process this, right? So we have some questions that are before you at your table. And they are, first of all, what is the most desperate situation that you've faced in your life? And then second, how did you respond? And third, how did God provide? Now, you know what, gentlemen? It may be that He hasn't provided yet. Now, what have we learned from this morning's lesson, if that's the case? Then you acknowledge it. You just say, you know what? It just absolutely stinks that it's not here yet. I'm still dealing with whatever it is that I'm dealing with. And I just want to be honest about that. So if that's where you are, voice that. So I'll turn you now over to your table leaders and let's go from there.